One of the things that we did in building the festival was we started 4 awards. The Mason Award for encouraging reading, Busboys and Poets Award for poetry, the Fairfax Prize for lifetime achievement in fiction, and tonight we're giving away the Mary Roberts Rinehart Award to a woman who writes in nonfiction. The goal in creating the awards was to try to focus attention on works that were important, and on writers whose works are important, and to bring writers and readers together. So this is celebratory, but it's also very much part and parcel of what the festival is about. Eula Biss, who lives in Chicago and teaches at Northwestern, has won numerous other awards: Carl Sandburg Literary Award, the Rona Jaffe Writers Award, the Grey Wolf Press Nonfiction Prize, the Pushcart Prize, the National Book Critics Circle Award. She's also a Guggenheim Fellow. So we thank you very much for coming and accepting what is basically a humble prize compared to some of those others that you've won. Her previous books are The Balloonists, which came out in 2002, and Notes from No Man's Land, which came out in 2009. And tonight we will have for sale Notes from No Man's Land and her newest one, On Immunity. To cite her credits, though, is only the sort of beginning point of noticing her importance as a writer. What I note in her work are juxtapositions, a kind of self-contained irony that fills our lives. She just identifies these and focuses the bright light that I'm looking at, focuses the bright light of her writerly attention on them in ways that makes us aware of them and makes it impossible for us to ignore them. She's engaging and entertaining at the same time in her work. She's probably most noteworthy, though, because she tackles such vital issues. In reviewing her first book, The Balloonist, Melissa Fernand says, in a beautiful blending of narrative styles, dialogue, brief anecdotes, and narrative theory, Biss navigates her narrative through complex relationships, remapping previously charted territory. However, with one important distinction: she offers no set destinations and no pre-drawn conclusions. Instead, The Balloonist is a continuation of life's unresolved arguments. What runs through all of her works is the absolutely keen insight that we're all connected. She begins Notes from No Man's Land with a quickly rendered history of the little-known fight that was put up by city council members and other public officials over the first telephone poles that went up in this country. If you think today's battles about Obamacare are kind of like weird, imagine city and town officials cutting down telephone poles because they didn't want the phone coming into their community. The telephone company had to go to the rather extreme measure of putting guys on the top of the poles to sit there to keep them from being cut down until the lines actually got stretched, and then they became protected by law. But until the line was stretched to the pole, you could cut the pole down, and nobody could do anything to you. Fascinating. And that's what I mean about juxtaposition. Here we are. How can you live without your cell phone, right? And when the phone first came out, Bell couldn't sell it, and people were opposed to it. It's that kind of juxtaposition that I find just so compelling about her work. Another element, in Goodbye to All That, which is an essay in No Man's Land, she points out the constructed nature of our lives and does this with her own life. She tells how a plumber named Sal helped her when she first moved to New York, painting her apartment for her, getting a refrigerator to replace and fixing it, one that was stolen. And she does a sort of a self-mocking joke in which she says, you know, before she could get downstairs and get it into her apartment, someone had stolen it. Well, then, in a kind of parenthetical, she says, the truth is, she was painfully lonely in her first days in New York, and she couldn't get the fridge up to her apartment because she didn't know anybody who could help her get it up to her apartment. And she lived in a building with no elevator, so she couldn't move it. So when she asked the landlord for a replacement fridge, he said, look, lady, take the place or find somewhere else to live. And she had nowhere else to go. So she stayed and she made it work. She's a truth teller in this way. She makes of life truth with which we can make our vital connections. Her newest book starts with her own motherhood, grows out of that, and her desire to protect her new son. She links that urge to the broader impulse we all have and to the myths and fairy tales in which mothers and fathers desire to protect their children and provide happy lives for them, but instead leave them with an unprotected heel, for example, or unwittingly give them to the devil instead of protecting them. She writes of the consequences of our unknowing acts. She goes on to observe that, quoting, "The belief that public health measures are not intended for people like us is widely held by many people like me," close quote. And the simple fact that we need germs in order to enable a child's immune system to become functional, so we shouldn't completely sanitize ourselves, even if we could. She traces the way some people see compelling immunizations as too much government authority that they don't trust. But she also notes how that actually sort of grows out of the state easily translating to a kind of body, the body of the state. Its arms, it has legs, it has the head of government. So you can see how the body and the government sort of become mixed. In the final paragraph, she writes, "We might imagine ourselves as a garden within a garden. I hope you weren't going to read the last paragraph. The outer garden is no Eden and no rose garden either. It is as strange and various as the inner garden of our bodies, where we host fungi and viruses and bacteria of both good and bad dispositions. This garden is unbounded and unkempt, bearing both fruit and thorns. Perhaps we should call it a wilderness, or perhaps community is sufficient. However we choose to think of the social body, we're each other's environment. Immunity is a shared space, a garden we tend together." In the best of my years as a journalist writing for daily newspapers, I had a mentor, Charlie McDowell, whose criteria for calling someone smart was if they could keep two thoughts in their head at one time. By Charlie's measure, Eula Biss is not only smart, she is also a uniquely empowering, writerly person, because through her work, she not only puts forth more than two thoughts, but three or four thoughts. She enables us to hold them all in our head at the same time. I'm very happy and pleased to be able to present to you the Mary Roberts Rinehart Award for a woman working in nonfiction.
Thank you for that incredibly generous introduction. This is a tremendous honor for me, one that's particularly meaningful because of who Mary Roberts Rinehart was. She was a working mother, a trained nurse, an incredibly prolific writer, the author of a work that inspired Batman, and an advocate who spoke publicly about having breast cancer when cancer was still unmentionable. So I hope that something of her legacy might be reflected in the book that I'm about to talk about. This is on immunity, which is due out in 2 weeks. And I'm going to read a few passages from the beginning, since you know the end now. So I'm going to start at the very beginning and skip around a bit. The first story I ever heard about immunity was told to me by my father, a doctor, when I was very young. It was the myth of Achilles, whose mother tried to make him immortal. She burned away his mortality with fire in one telling of the story, and Achilles was left impervious to injury everywhere except his heel, where a poisoned arrow would eventually wound and kill him. In another telling, the infant Achilles was immersed in the river Styx, the river that divides the world from the underworld. His mother held her baby by his heel to dip him in the water, leaving, again, one fatal vulnerability. When Rubens painted the life of Achilles, the river Styx is where he began. Bats fly across the sky of that painting, and the dead ride a ferry in the distance. Achilles dangles from his mother's hand by one plump leg, with his